everyone. Welcome again. My name is Jiu Chang. I'm a program lead for inclusive research and design at the Partnership on AI. And we're delighted to host this webinar in partnership with the Global Democracy Coalition. Today, we'll be discussing turning inclusive research and design into practice and developing AI responsibly. It is my great pleasure to be here today with our speakers, Dr. Custis and Dr. Tina Park, whom I will introduce momentarily. So in this webinar, I will kick us off and introduce our speakers, and you will hear a fireside chat between Christine and Tina. For those of you who are joining a PAI event for the first time, first welcome. And the Partnership on AI is a nonprofit partnership of academics, civil society, industry, and media stakeholders who have come together to explore and address important and difficult issues around the future of AI. And our work contributes to the development of resources, recommendations, and best practices for AI. And we currently have 5 program areas: AI and media integrity, AI, labor and the economy, fairness, transparency, and accountability, and about ML, which is about documentation, inclusive research and design, and safety critical AI. And we will share how you can stay connected to our work and learn more. We have a newsletter, and our website has a lot of resources. So we'll help share some of those resources in the chat. And with that, I am pleased to introduce our speakers, Dr. Christine Custis and Dr. Tina Park. Dr. Christine Custis is the Director of Programs and Research at the Partnership on AI. She focuses on managing PAI's portfolio of research and programs, which include holding convenings on emerging international challenges, conducting research to develop resources, tools, and recommendations, and promoting adoption of best practices with our global community of partners. Christine is also an associate professor at Shenandoah University in the School of Business, where she teaches and conducts research on how enterprises should use information systems and technology to innovate and achieve organizational goals. Her distinguished career includes 20 years of experience with strategy, project management, and enterprise architecture. Christine holds a PhD in business administration from Morgan State University. And we have Dr. Tina Park, who is the head of inclusive research and design at PAI. She's focusing on working with impacted communities on equity-driven research frameworks to support the responsible development of AI. Building on PAI's Methods for Inclusion project, this initiative aims to research, design, and pilot inclusive practices developed in collaboration with community-based academic, policy, and corporate partners. Prior to PAI, Tina led efforts to cultivate supportive intellectual spaces for scholars of color at Brown University and nationwide. Her scholarship has focused on research designs and theoretical frameworks used by sociologists to study racism and social inequality. Her career includes nearly 15 years of experience with economic development analysis, urban policy research, project management, and curriculum development. Tina received a PhD in sociology from Brown University. And with that, I will turn it over to Christine and Tina.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And thank you to all of you who are joining us today for this fireside chat. I want to just begin with some basic information and ask you, Tina, what do you mean when you say inclusive and responsible development of AI?
Thanks for kicking us off with an easy question this morning. Hi to everyone who's joining us live on the web stream, and to those of you who are listening to the recording. So first of all, we're seeing a rise in the adoption of responsible AI principles to guide the development and deployment of this technology, which is fantastic. But that also means that there's a lot of discussion and what I hope is healthy debate about what constitutes that idea of responsible or ethical or even inclusive. Generally speaking, we have a lot of agreement that involves values like fairness, reliability and safety, privacy and security, inclusiveness, transparency, and accountability, that these are all core to the responsible development of algorithms that are powering AI technology. Now, the commitment for using AI to the betterment of everyone needs to mean that, we need to make sure that algorithms are ultimately fair, that people are not having unequal outcomes or unequal experiences when they're using it, that algorithms themselves should not have intentional or even unintentional discriminatory effects, whether that's on individuals or groups, and that we need to address whether there are barriers that could unintentionally exclude people from accessing some of the benefits that this new technology can provide. And that's whether that's generated by the use of AI systems in terms of making our lives more efficient and easier, or the kinds of decisions that are made in terms of determining the kinds of resources and opportunities we're granted. So there's generally agreement on all of those things. We also agree that AI systems should consistently operate as they were originally designed to do, and that they can resist harmful manipulation. So this idea that when we build these systems, they shouldn't be easy to hack, they shouldn't be easy to manipulate into causing harm for certain people, and that they work in the way that we think that they're supposed to work. And to do all this, it means recognizing that there can be potential for misuse or degradation of quality that we need to be thinking about and be ready to remediate if that were to happen. So when we say inclusive and responsible development, we mean all of these things, and that if any one of these things are missing, really, we're at the risk of having exclusionary and unethical development.
Thank you so much. And I just want to +1 the idea of planning for scenarios that are possibly the adverse of what we really want. That's really important. I'll pause here and just ask folks who are interested in this information, the inclusive research and design work that we're doing here at the Partnership on AI. If you could just take a look at the chat, you'll see a link that will take you to where you can join the mailing list for the newsletters that these teams send out, and that you can possibly join us for future seminars and conversations. We'd really love for you to be part of the conversation. Okay, we'll keep going. Tell us, Tina, how can developers and deployers of AI systems work together to reduce harm while improving inclusion and social benefit?
Well, I think we need to recognize that algorithmic models, even if they are built with the best of intentions, and even if we think that they may be somewhat frivolous, like they only have a small part in a larger system, we have to recognize that these are all extremely consequential and can have unintended negative impacts on people. It doesn't matter what the scale of it is. It doesn't matter at what phase of any system or decision-making that we're using those algorithms, that they all have impact. And in many ways, we're not always sure what the downstream impact is going to be, which is why we're so focused on making sure that these algorithmic models are built responsibly and inclusively. Couple of things we need to recognize. One is that AI systems are ultimately human products, even ones that are self-improving or self-generating. At the core of them, they start with people behind the code designing and making decisions on how, where, and when algorithmic models should be deployed. That means that social inequality exists within these AI systems, much like any other tool, because we are making certain important assumptions and determinations about them. And the thing that we have to remember is that because of this, AI systems can have the potential to deepen existing inequality if it's not leveraged well. And another thing we have to remember is that AI systems should not be designed, developed, and deployed in a vacuum with no one to claim responsibility for those consequences. I think it's easy to say that we just sort of create something and we let it out into the world, but that's not really how it works. At the end of the day, it may do harm, it may do good. And we have to remember that people are behind it and people are ultimately going to be impacted by it. And so it's important that we create accountability mechanisms and transparency mechanisms so that if something does go wrong, we can actually remediate it. As developers, I think we have a responsibility to do what we can along every step of the way to ensure that algorithmic models are doing what they're supposed to do while harming or excluding as few people as possible. That means thinking about the whole of the AI development lifecycle and thinking about where are all the different moments and components where we can be thinking about what the impact will be, whose perspectives and experiences are we not drawing upon yet and should be drawing upon, and what that impact can be downstream. a broader array of people, especially users and those who are impacted by the deployment of algorithmic systems, should have insight into the entirety of the model and its life cycle, including how it's been developed, what went into its development, whether that's the labor, the data sources and the data sets that go into the training models, and then ultimately the decisions that were made in terms of how it's going to be deployed. And these are folks who are going to be really crucial to helping developers and researchers identify situations where these systems may not work or be harmful, because at the end of the day, we are limited by the kinds of life experiences we do have. And this is where, that old adage of teamwork makes the dream work really comes into play, that the more, the greater number of experiences and insights and perspectives we have, the more likely we're able to see the things that we don't know. And we can actually prepare ourselves to plan for those eventualities.
I love that. I love that. It is a lot about experiences, lived experiences of impacted and marginalized communities. I love the concept of, we're thinking about the shiny new thing right now, which is generative AI and frontier AI and large language models, but there's data that goes into the algorithms in those models. And even before that data, there are human beings that are cleaning and labeling and categorizing that data. So just thinking about those lived experiences and making sure those folks are included in the conversation as we design, develop, and deploy AI. Thank you so much, Tina. I'll keep going here. If you would, talk a little bit about how the Partnership on AI helps to support these efforts towards inclusive and responsible AI.
Yeah, and I think, one of the things that Partnership on AI is, I would like to think a little bit unique, is that we really think about the entirety of the development lifecycle. So you're mentioning, it's really important for us to think about not only, what these AI systems can do, but, what is going into them, right? What are the data sets that go into them, but also who are the people behind it that are making sure that these systems can work? So, we're thinking about the people, as you mentioned, that are perhaps cleaning up and labeling the data that is so core and, comes down to building the infrastructure of the systems that we're building off of. Who are they? How are their working conditions? Are they also experiencing, all the positive benefits that are being promised to us by AI technology? Or, is their labor being misused and abused? So, we have a lot of different work streams that think about each of those different angles and different points in the development life cycle. And we've conducted a lot of original research to understand the experience of those folks and other AI practitioners who are trying to integrate responsible AI principles into their day-to-day work. And then we build off of that research to develop resources and guidance to strengthen that alignment and integration of these values, because we know that it can be really hard to go from, that really broad abstract idea of like fairness into actually, living that in your day-to-day life and applying that into your day-to-day work. So specifically, we have a couple of different program areas that lead on different project work streams. Jiu mentioned at the top of the call, we have, our About ML project, which is one of our big projects around documentation practices. And it draws on some of the best practices that have been discussed over the last 5 to 10 years around the importance of, really clear and useful documentation to make sure that we understand, again, what are the data sets that are being used to build our models? How are we tracking the versions of these different models? Are these documentations artifacts accessible to other members of the public to make sure that, again, it's not just the developers who are looking at them, but other people who are able to hold these systems accountable to any of the harms that they might cause and have, the evidence to be able to explore that. We also have another project on ethical data sourcing practices. So we know that people are behind the data that we use for these systems to train our models. So is that data being sourced ethically with the best, with the most thoughtful labor practices in mind in terms of fair pay, fair working conditions, and reasonable working conditions? The work that I lead is on inclusive public engagement practices. So, we're talking a lot about, what can we do to make sure that all these different points of view are being brought into the development process. But again, doing that kind of public engagement work is incredibly challenging. And there's a lot of ways in which we can ultimately fail by taking in a lot of feedback, but not utilizing it properly, not reaching out to the right people, not knowing how to talk to a diverse group of people. And so where we focus there is about how to break down some of those processes and procedures and approaches and make them more accessible to our fellow AI practitioners. We also have work on inclusive worker and labor practices, as well as our newly released responsible practices for synthetic media. So we're talking about, right now, the biggest thing that everyone's concerned about is generative AI. And so do we have, a responsible practices framework available for those who are helping generate synthetic media, like, generative AI developed images and text and things like that. So we have a really rich online resource library, which has things like an in-depth guide on documentation best practices, templates and guides on how to source data for model development more ethically, as well as guiding principles for ethical public engagement that should be linked for you in the chat. In this coming year, we're excited to be doing a lot of work. We'll be introducing learning modules to introduce data and AI practitioners to different frameworks and strategies on how to build technology with impacted communities for social benefit. And across all of our different program areas and work streams, we're going to be publishing case studies with concrete examples of different tech organizations, both nonprofit research groups and large tech companies who are integrating different responsible AI practices to understand what worked and what was challenging for them and how it was addressed. And we're really hopeful that these really specific case studies will be useful for other AI practitioners, because we know that sometimes, again, it's easier to learn from really concrete examples as opposed to sort of in the abstract or in the imaginary.
That's awesome. We have a couple of questions here we can move to, but before we do, I just want to take a couple of steps back and tell you our intention at PAI. About 6 years ago, several of the big tech companies got together and just felt like, we really need an objective space to have these conversations about responsible AI, because we're all going to be facing the same issues. And that really is the genesis of the Partnership on AI, having an objective place where all these different tech companies, startups, media organizations, advocacy groups, civil society organizations, academic institutions, research labs, having a place where we can all sort of have these conversations. And so it's our intention to be the convener of these diverse voices. And I say all that to say all of the amazing work that my colleague just mentioned for you, we want your voice in the room. If you're not already there, please find ways to engage. Engagement can look like coming to a session like today. It can look like joining a working group. It can look like being a member of a community of practice. It can look like co-producing an artifact for public consumption. It can look like any feedback you have on any of the tools and checklists and recommendations that we already have on our website. And so we just want to encourage you to add your voice and your experiences and the experiences of the people for whom you represent to the space and be a part of that. So thank you in advance for getting engaged in this work with us. Okay, one of the questions that came in, thank you so much for the questions, and I encourage folks to add more. The question is, the main challenge is to identify the misuse or adverse use. Do you have any tips?
Oh, that is a huge, huge issue. And I would say there's a lot of different ways we can approach it, right? So in terms of how we think about it within our program area is, if you're at the start of developing your team, developing your project, start to build in those opportunities to do that kind of public consultation, to build sort of a brain trust of people, not just with technical expertise, but what we refer to as experiential expertise. So people who have the lived experiences of facing discrimination, facing adverse harm, facing technological exclusion, so that you have a set of people who can provide insights for you that you may not be able to immediately see. This goes deeper than just holding focus groups or having beta testers, because the expectation is that you have a set of people who can go along with you through the entire process, who can have impact at different moments and be able to address, identify and address the issues early on, not just sort of once once your product or your system is already like fully developed and you're sort of just doing minor tweaks. But I also recognize that that is not always an option. Building out those kinds of diverse teams, building out those opportunities, has a major impact both on costs and also just on the availability of time, especially when you have major deadlines to hit. And so if you are building from scratch, I would say like think about those kinds of different social infrastructures you can put into place so that it is easier to do that. However, for those of you who are sort of in process, there are so many different resources available. I think different groups are coming out with risk management frameworks, risk identification frameworks, and things like that. And what we found is, there's a lot that you can look backwards and hope to identify, but there are also things that we just don't know until we see it. And that means it's really important to be in community and in conversation with others who are also really concerned about the misuse or adverse impact of technology. And so this is where things like the communities of practice that we're standing up within Partnership on AI, or other communities like this, where you have the opportunity to talk about your work with other like-minded professionals who are grappling with the same kind of issues, are incredibly useful. Because in many instances, we're building the life raft as we're floating at sea, and we need everyone sort of chipping in to help identify where the leaks are happening, because in many ways these are new issues that we're dealing with, or new manifestations of old problems that we're dealing with. And so we need to be able to collectively build that knowledge base together. And so, participating in spaces like this, connecting with other people who are also thinking about this and talking openly about the problems that you have. Internally, what I've seen work really well for other practitioners, especially through some of the research that I did on the ways that different AI practitioners are utilizing inclusive and participatory engagement methods, is starting these kinds of communities within your own organization. So whether that's smaller working groups or ad hoc groups, where you reach out to other fellow members of your team that you may not always speak to say like, hey, we know this is going to be an issue. Can we take time off maybe regularly on a bi-weekly basis to think about this? Like, can we be reading some of the latest research that's coming out so that we can understand what the implications are going to be for our work? Can we be attending more conferences or webinars to stay up to date on some of the issues that people are grappling with, and keeping a pulse on some of the current events, right, that are happening, and making sure that you have an attentiveness to what users and impacted communities are experiencing, making sure that you have touch points with your own user base in order for them to be able to tell you what's going wrong, and so that you can be really adaptive and agile. And so it's a little bit of a dissatisfying answer in terms of we don't have a checklist, because in many cases, these are issues that are very emergent, but we have a very bright and I think invested set of peers among us that allows us to be able to come together and really talk about this more thoroughly and problem solve this as it comes. I think some of the things that we're seeing at PAI is that as we work across, our 100+ organizations, what we find is that even though the problem feels hyper unique and hyper exclusive to like maybe your own product, in a sense, it's an issue that everyone is dealing with. And so the more that we can bring these issues out into the open and talk about them, the faster we can and the better we can be about solving some of these issues.
Yes, fantastic. Absolutely. And the key word there is in community. We want to hurry to get to the solutioning, the retooling, the reskilling. But it's okay if we begin just by normalizing these conversations, and encourage you to normalize these conversations in your organization. Thank you so much. Let's go to another question we have here. In your view, how can public policies help ensure responsible and inclusive AI?
Yeah, that is such a fantastic question. And, at PAI, we're so excited about some of the new policies and regulations and even frameworks that are coming out both in the US in terms of the blueprint for the AI Bill of Rights, across the EU with the EU AI Act. We think these are all incredibly positive steps to help normalize expectations around inclusive and responsible AI, that they set a set of minimum standards for people to be orienting themselves towards. When it comes to inclusive AI, I think some of the biggest positive steps I've seen are requirements for public consultation. So this expectation that you will have some form and some mechanism for engaging with the rest of the world, right, with people, to ensure that, again, you're able to identify, address, and mitigate any potential harms. That there are moments built in the development process for us to pause, get more feedback before we launch, right? Before we take something out and deploy it into the rest of the world. I think oftentimes in technology, we're really eager to get things out in front of people that, we're really comfortable with this idea of beta testing and retooling as we go, which is really fantastic. But it also means that when we have really powerful tools that are AI enabled, we may generate a lot of harm while we're in that testing phase. And I think we have to be a little bit more cautious. And so the expectations that some of these public policies and regulations are setting out, where it's like, hey, why don't you actually take a moment to do that testing, to do that exploration, maybe in a sandbox before we release it out into the rest of the world, get more feedback, is a really positive step. And it feels like it's such a minor change, but it's a very profound and important one, that we're telling developers right now to slow down, to think about the impact of their work, to think about all the different people that may interact with, to both sort of adapt and use those systems for themselves and think about what those implications might be. Just that slowing down process is incredibly important for us right now. And I think the more that our public policies and our regulations can really encourage that and safeguard our developers and practitioners to be able to take that time and encourage people to take that time is going to be really important.
Absolutely. And I just want to reiterate something you said, Tina, about taking the time, pausing, and thinking heavily about downstream consequences. I put in the chat there some of the work that PAI has done in the past as it relates to responsible publication norms, even before the software is developed and even before it is deployed in its beta form. Even the idea that we share in our conference papers, in our conference workshops, in our academic publications and peer-reviewed papers, even thinking about being careful at that stage because of how quickly AI can just promulgate and go and just spread once the idea is shared. So we're thinking about that in our safety critical program area, not just responsible publication norms for the idea, but responsible deployment. Maybe we don't want to just put it out on Twitter and let people play around with it. Maybe we want some protocols. Maybe we want to put a few guardrails in place as we deploy these very powerful systems. So that's really important. Thank you so much for that.
Just to also add, I mean, I think, one of the big things at a PAI we've been promoting is this idea of like really good documentation, right? And that's some of the work that you were leading before coming on board as our director, is that we need to know and understand what's going into these systems, how we're developing them, and having that paper trail, right? And that's really what that documentation is about. Having that paper trail and having the documentation in a way that it's accessible to people other than even just like the most highly skilled technical developer is really important to make sure that, again, people can engage with all levels of the system. That if they wanted to, they can go back and they can read about it. They can understand sort of like what went into its development, what data sets were used. Like, is that the right data set to use? Like, was that data set even collected responsibly? Or, was it scraped from the internet without a lot of consent? And, through that process, is it doing harm? Like, these are all different issues that we want developers to be a little bit more thoughtful about. And again, some of the expectations that we're seeing now come through public policy around having clear documentation, having a clear understanding of where you're sourcing your data to develop your models, again, are all really important steps that we're taking to make sure that the AI that is being produced in the future will be done so in a responsible and ethical way.
Absolutely. The way we source that data and the way we equitably govern the data throughout the life cycle as well. Those are important things that PAI is considering. Okay, a couple more questions here. We invite several more. I think we've got about 7 more minutes we can take questions. So feel free to pile on and we'll get to as many as we can. Another main challenge is getting companies to invest in responsible initiatives, especially when these initiatives seem to compete with their move fast cultures or their bottom line. Any tips on getting buy-in?
That is such a huge question. And, to be honest, I think on a regular basis, I feel that anxiety too. I think especially right now, we're seeing in a lot of our tech companies, major layoffs, and a lot of our responsible AI teams are being affected by this. And so I say this with all the empathy that is such a huge, huge issue. Part of it is, I think, the work that we do as PAI, and, Christine mentioned, our founding was based around, 6 individuals from large tech companies who really thought this was a space that needed collective action. And so part of the work that we do is we try to build, the kinds of resources that are necessary for the actual people who are building the tech. But we also host conversations with the people who are making those decisions that are sometimes far removed. So the folks, in the C-suite, in those leadership and management roles, and making sure that we're translating the work and the experiences of the practitioners themselves into the narratives that, those who are in leadership can understand, and so that they can understand what the business impact is going to be if they don't make these kinds of changes, and if they don't make these kinds of investments in building responsible AI teams, in building the skill sets that practitioners really need in order to do this work effectively. And so I think part of it is we need to be doing that kind of advocacy at a lot of different levels. In the work that we do, and the resources we develop, a part of it is also just helping practitioners become more comfortable talking about this work overall and talking about the importance of this overall, so that you can do that kind of internal advocacy for yourself, whether it's talking to your project managers or your team managers around, hey, we should maybe take the time to do this because ... right? Because it's going to have an impact on, on our final product, because there's going to be regulation coming that we need to be prepared for, because there's actual harms that may actually undercut our ability to make a profit, from the products that we're building, because we might have to deal with some really bad use cases. And so part of, what we're trying to enable is not just doing the work, but also how you talk about the work, so that you can do that kind of internal advocacy for yourselves. And again, that's where, we really believe that bringing you together in these sort of multi-stakeholder bodies, talking to academics, talking to civil society organizations, talking to other researchers is really important, is so that you can be, strengthening your own knowledge and your own pool of resources to be able to do that. And we, when we're building our relationships with our partners, it's happening at both that leadership level and at the practitioner level, so that, we can be supporting you as a practitioner in terms of doing that advocacy in those meetings with that leadership, and making sure that they understand some of the downstream consequences of, like, if they don't take this seriously, what's going to happen. So part of it is, it's all of us having to do this together. If you are a practitioner yourself, it's getting a little bit more savvy with how to talk about it, so that you can do your own advocacy, and utilizing the resources that we do have available at PAI, both in terms of the resources we have that are written, but also joining, again, our communities of practice and our working groups, so that you can get more comfortable doing that kind of advocacy work, and carving out that kind of space within your own teams and organizations to talk about these issues. And, again, we build the kinds of relationships that are necessary so that we do see the kind of policy impact, so that, again, there is policy and regulation supporting this work and enforcing this work. And again, translating some of these impacts over, so that people who are just more concerned with that bottom line, with that move fast culture, that, there are some real challenging consequences to them if they don't shift.
Absolutely. And I'd say too, just beginning to understand the return on investment for spending time with the resources that are available, for being in these conversations where you're affecting change in this way. One of the things that we work on here at PAI is not just releasing tools and checklists and recommendations and learnings, but encouraging pilots, encouraging organizations to go out and use them and then tell us how it went, what worked, what didn't work. Is there something that's especially tricky in fintech or in health AI? So use those tools, but then report back, let us know your progress so that those pilots can continue to inform the actual return on the investment that your organization can get from doing this very important work. So
we run those partnerships and those collaborations with some of the big tech leaders, so that again we can show that even the biggest companies and the biggest organizations who lead in this field are thinking about this. They're also grappling with the same kinds of issues. You know, they have some wins, they also face some challenges. And by bringing this conversation out into the open, we're hoping that, you know, if you're with a smaller organization or a smaller team, you have some talking points to leverage to be like, hey, this group is also dealing with this. Maybe we should slow down a minute and try to follow their lead, right? Or if, you know, we also work with smaller groups who are very brave and willing to put themselves in the forefront and work with us to implement some of these changes. And we can highlight that work as well.
That's right. That's right. Thank you, Tina. We have time for about 2 more questions and then we'll summarize and wrap up. The next question here is about transparency. Transparency is perhaps the most crucial aspect of discussing AI ethics, and it relies on open ways of developers and companies such as code openness in the development and application of AI technology. As competition surrounding the development and utilization of AI intensifies, how can transparency truly be achieved?
That's a really tough question. And Christine, I might even defer to you to think about it, because I think your leadership on the documentation work is really at the core of this, right? And I think what we've seen is there is a balance between having to release your proprietary information out into the world before you're ready to, and sharing some of the core fundamentals that people need to see in order to ensure that these systems are being developed in a way that's ethical and responsible. That you don't have to necessarily sacrifice details in order to have the mechanisms in place to allow for mutual accountability and transparency. And I think that's a lot of the conversations that we've been having with many of our partners, is that you can still have redacted sections so long as you're like, part of it is that like, is your team actually capable of talking about it if that time comes, right? And what we're finding is a lot of times that like people don't necessarily have the skill set in order to like talk about and translate over the important parts of their code or their models, because we haven't been asked to think about it in that way. And so if there ever does come a time where we have to move towards code openness, like we're not prepared for it. And there is a way in which you can talk about these things without having to reveal trade secrets. And so part of it is having to think about like transparency doesn't mean you walk around fully exposed. It's about releasing the necessary and important and relevant bits of information that can help others help you be more ethical, be more responsible, be more inclusive. And I think if you take a look through our, about ML resources and the documentation best practices, that's what we really emphasize is there's a way to talk about these things without having to jeopardize, the security of your own organization.
That's right. I did share one resource there in the chat that just talks about all the different opportunities for transparency through documentation. And so it is possible to redact, obfuscate certain portions of your data while still giving very meaningful input and insight into the way you architected your models, into the way you managed your hyperparameters, right? There's ways to inform and educate for those who will in the future test and validate and use your models or even the data sets that you used without giving up proprietary information. So that is wonderful. Our last question is a very interesting one. The question is, what do you think about the AI incidents database for developing responsible and inclusive AI? Why should a company post an incident? This is so exciting because this is a project that PAI helped to start. We lent the grant money to the engineer, Sean McGregor, who did a wonderful job of standing up this database. It is truly an open resource. It is truly a community architected, I like to call it a repository of receipts, right? And so it is instances that have been captured in different news stories where AI has actually caused harm. And so the future of this database is super important. It's going to include more risk mitigation, more best practices, opportunities for organizations to come back and give an update on how they handled the situation. It's super important for organizations to self-report. And even if they don't self-report, to come back and tell the world how they handled the situation. Why? Because what they learn, others can learn from them, right? And what others learn, they then can learn. This is a part of that community, the conversation, the convening that we talked about before. So we've got other resources on the website if you want to go and take a look and learn more and see the evolution of that incident database. But I'll go ahead and pause here and just move into the summarization of our time together. We want to let you go on time. Thank you again for coming and joining us. Please do engage in the work with us. We know that it is important to recognize that AI and algorithmic systems can both help and harm people. We can't fixate solely on what is good about technological innovation. We want to create technology that is good. And it is for social good and societal good. Responsible AI is an intersection of different principles which emphasize the transparency of the technology for a diversity of audiences so that there can be accountability for both the good and bad of technology. Data and algorithmic models are not neutral nor perfect. They are human-made and also prone to imperfections and intentional and unintentional biases. PAI has a number of original research and resources to support practitioners who are invested in aligning their work with responsible AI principles.